Welcome back. We now have a Boolean on the animation blueprint that will be true or false based on whether or not we're pressing the right mouse button. We'd like to use that to change our animation, and we'll be doing that using aiming and not aiming state machines. So far, we've created one state machine called locomotion. We're going to create new state machines and find out how to use them. We're going to switch to aiming based on the isAiming Boolean that we added to the animation blueprint. Let's get started. Now, I'm here in FPS AnimBP. This is our animation blueprint. Now, I no longer need to print values to the screen as I'm confident that I know that they're changing, so I'm going to go ahead and delete those nodes. Now, let's go back to our anim graph. Now, here in the anim graph, I'm inside the locomotion state machine, and I can tell by looking at this black bar here, and I can go back out into the anim graph by clicking anim graph. Now, the anim graph tends to pile up its tabs because as we double click to open a state machine or double click on a state to go inside of it, we get a tab up here above the black bar, and you can see that I have multiple locomotion tabs. So it's important to close these pretty frequently, otherwise they'll soon pile up into lots and lots of tabs. Now, going back out into the locomotion state machine, I see that I have idle and walking. Now, we also are going to have aiming. Now, we have an arms aim idle and we have an arms aim walk, which means that not only do we have idle and walking for not aiming, we have idle and walking for aiming. That's 4 different animations. Now, it's typically a good idea to not let these state machines get too out of control. And to manage our state machines, we can have other state machines inside of them. You can create new state machines from within states. For example, if I go into idle, if I right-click, I can type state machine, and I can create a new state machine here in the idle state. Going back out to locomotion, I'm now in a state machine and not a state. You cannot create a state machine from within another state machine. You have to be in one of its states. Now, I'd like to have 2 states here, one for aiming and one for not aiming, and then each of those states can handle idle to walk transitions. So I'm going to hold the Alt key and click on the entry pin to remove that arrow so I can move these 2 states up and out of the way. And I'm going to add 2 new states, one for aiming and one for not aiming. So I'm going to click and drag off, select Add State, and type aiming. And I'm going to right click and create a new state and call this one not aiming. Now we have 2 different states. Now, let's take care of the aiming state first. I'm going to open that aiming state and right-click to make a new state machine. So I'm going to type state machine and select add new state machine, and I'm going to call this aiming state machine. And I'm going to hook that up to the output pose. Now, double-clicking that, we see that it's empty, but we'll take care of that. We'll go back out into the locomotion state machine, and we'll take these idle and walking states and Control X to cut those, and we have them copied. Now we can go back into aiming and into the aiming state machine and Control V to paste them in. Now I can hook entry up to idle. And now all of this logic for idle to walking transitions is here in the aiming state machine, which exists inside of the aiming state. So that takes care of aiming. But we also need to take care of not aiming. So we can double click on not aiming and make a not aiming state machine. Let's right click and type state machine, create this new state machine, and rename it to not aiming state machine. And we can hook it up to output animation pose. Now I can double click the not aiming state machine and I can Control V because I still had idle and walking copied from back when I hit Control X. And I can hook these up. So now we have idle and walking in both the aiming and the not aiming state machines. Now here's the thing, we want our aiming state machine to play the correct animations. While we're aiming, we don't want the regular idle and walking animations, we want the aiming idle and aiming walking animations. So let's go into the idle state, and instead of playing arms idle, we're going to play arms aim idle. So let's find that here in the asset browser and drag that in and hook that up to the output animation pose. And now we can delete play arms idle. Now let's go back out one level, and we're back in the aiming state machine. And we're going to go into walking, and instead of playing arms walk, we want to play arms aim walk. So let's drag that in, hook it up, and delete arms walk. Now back out in the aiming state machine, we can rename these states so that we know exactly what animations are being played. I'm going to call this one aim idle, and I'm going to call this one aim walking. Now, very important, we should be in the aiming state machine, not in the not aiming state machine. So if you're getting weird behavior, make sure that you put the correct animations in the correct state machine. So we can go back out into locomotion, and we now have aiming and not aiming. So our animation blueprint now just needs to know when it should be in the aiming state versus the not aiming state. So your challenge will be to complete the locomotion state machine by adding these transitions between aiming and not aiming. For the transition rules, you're going to use the isAiming Boolean. We want to be in the correct state based on this value. And remember, there is a not Boolean node that we can use to check to see if a Boolean is false. Pause the video and complete the locomotion state machine now. Okay, so we just need some transitions between these states. I'm going to click on the edge of aiming and drag to the edge of not aiming. So I'm going to click from not aiming and drag to aiming. And so we have two transition rules, one going from aiming to not aiming and one going the other way. Now, to go from not aiming to aiming, we want to do that when isAiming is true. So let's go into that transition rule and drag in isAiming and hook that up. Now let's go back out to locomotion and add a transition rule from aiming to not aiming. We want to do this when isAiming is false. So I'm going to drag that in, get isAiming, and from this I'm going to use a not Boolean, and we'll hook this up for this transition rule. Now our locomotion state machine is complete. Now you may be wondering, why are we going straight into the aiming pose? Well, we'll go straight into the aiming pose, but if the isAiming Boolean is false, then we'll transition directly into not aiming. So we'll never actually see ourselves aiming unless we start off aiming. We can test this out by compiling and hitting play. So if I hit play and I hold the right mouse button, I go into the aiming pose. And if I release, I go back. This is great, but our aiming pose looks a little off, which means we'll need to reposition our mesh so that it's a little bit lower and probably more to the left. Now, to make adjusting this easier, let's go back into FPS Character and go into the viewport and select our mesh. Now, for our mesh, we need to adjust it based on that aiming pose. So we can assign that aiming pose. Under Animation Mode, we'll select Use Animation Asset, and we'll set this to Arms Aim Idle. Now we're in the aiming pose here in the blueprint, and we can adjust this. So I'm first going to drag the mesh down just a bit, and then I'm going to look at it from the point of view of the camera. So I'm going to zoom in to about right here. That looks about right. Now I can look at this mesh from the top by clicking up here where it says Perspective and selecting Top. And now scrolling in with the mouse wheel, I can make sure that our gun is positioned at roughly the center. So I can drag it just a little to the left, and now I see that it looks about right. Now I'm going to click Compile and go back from top into Perspective mode, and we can play test this again. Now we can test this out, but we want to reassign our animation blueprint. So select Mesh, and for animation mode, select Use Animation Blueprint, and make sure it has FPS and MBP selected. It'll have an _C at the end. That's normal, the engine will tack that on. So let's play test this. I'm going to right click, and now I'm aiming. Now, I might want to move it down just a bit, and according to your preferences, you can adjust this until you get it looking just right. You can also go into the mesh editor and rotate that socket until the gun is positioned correctly. So I'm going to briefly make a couple of adjustments. First, I'm going to move the mesh down very slightly. And then I'm going to go into the mesh editor, find that hand socket, and I'm going to rotate it up very slightly, just a bit. That way we'll straighten it out. Now I can hit play, and that looks pretty good. I can see that little aiming pin between the two notches. Perfect. So in this lecture, we created the aiming and not aiming state machines, and we're using the isAiming Boolean in transition rules between states, aiming and not aiming. And now we have the aiming mechanic here in our game, so this is great. We're one step closer to completing our shooter game. I'll see you in the next lecture.